My name is Brett Bertelson. I am interviewing Scarlett Bertelson. The date is October 22nd, 2024, and we are at Scarlett's house, at my childhood home.
So I started this project with a specific goal in mind. I had a couple, for sure, that didn't end up working out. The piece you're seeing now is definitely not what I had in mind and not as in-depth as I wanted it to be, and this isn't even my original introduction. I actually got rid of my more formal introduction and or vomited onto a page to kind of explain my project and intentions and methods. What I had intended to do first was produce a video that got right down to the bottom of the barrel with prejudices embedded in the ideals of the Wild West, horse shows, and rural culture. I wanted it to be some kind of production that explained what many people know but never say about participating in these kind of rodeo events. I wanted to analyze the culture, the fashion, the competition, and the root causes and prejudices and systemic issues of such things. Instead, I learned that maybe my mom's experience, whose interview I really wanted to center, I learned that maybe this doesn't fit into all of those narratives. Instead, I accepted that maybe this video could take a cultural turn, as I learned in Dr. Fraser's class, to examine only one culture in one place at one time. Instead of comparing change over time of the entire sport with my mom's experience, I chose to center my mom's experience and compare it with rodeo culture and Western media. The first part of this video will look at the rodeo environment and the rural environment that my mom, Scarlett, was competing in, and how this environment stems from farming values and labor division learned while growing up rurally. This environment is somewhat androgynous, valuing character over gender. In the second part of this video, I'll examine broader Western themes within the 1980s pop culture and how this compares to my mom's experience. Hopefully, by looking at the Western expectation versus the rural environment, one can get a sense of what it might be like to live in a rural area in the 1980s and how this doesn't at all fit any kind of narrative of the typical 1980s. It wasn't all Miami Vice, right? Rodeo history is deeper than cowboys and gunslingers. In fact, it comes from a largely unknown Mexican heritage with historical roots in the 16th century. Later, Mexican ranch hands of the early 1800s, known as vaqueros, popularized their sport while ranching along the present-day United States border and up into Texas, which was swept up by who we think of today as cowboys. In the United States, Wild West shows became embedded in popular culture. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, Canadian equestrian events began in the early 1800s with hunting on horseback. The first event, the Montreal Fox Hunt, was established in the early 1820s, and although rodeos were unofficially held across the country, and particularly in the prairies, official rodeos were not held until the early 1900s when spectators wanted to pay to see Wild West cowboy stunts. The first official rodeo was held to honor this Wild West legacy. That was its theme. Its first year was 1912, and this became the first Calgary Stampede. According to Heidi Thomas, the first cowgirls learned to ride out of necessity on their ranches and farms before becoming involved in gaming. In Canada, women were participating in hunting on horseback recorded as early as 1873. As any other thing for men that women were not to touch, these women were deemed loose and thought to have damaged reproductive organs, but they persevered and cemented cowgirls as determined, classic Western icons. Rodeo associations began in the 1930s in Canada, and events ramped up from there. By the latter half of the 20th century, large-scale horse shows had become extremely popular. Roy Einson, the founder of the Ontario Quarter Horse Association and the Ontario Rodeo Association, held the first Quarterama in 1969. Quarterama was Canada's largest single-breed horse show, and it was a huge success. At its height in the mid-1980s, this is where a 15-year-old Scarlett West bought her riding chaps from a vendor while on a trip with her 4-H club.
But I purchased my chaps at Quarterama in Toronto, which is a very, very big, sought-after horse show that I was just lucky enough to get to watch with a 4-H group. And I had saved my money for them because I knew I could really use them, and brought a bunch of money with me and bought them there. I mean, luckily the vendors were there. I had heard that they usually have the vendors, similar to the Royal Winter Fair. And actually that show took place at the same location as the Royal Winter Fair in Toronto. And so that's where I bought them.
My mom was 10 years old in 1980, so she had her teenage years in the time of neon athletic wear, big hair, and suddenly portable music. This was not how she fully experienced the 1980s, however. Instead, she wore denim and cowgirl boots. Her hair was still big, don't get me wrong, but it was under her hat. She was too busy competing in horse shows.
Can you tell us a little bit about barrel racing and pole bending? How does it work? What did you do?
Well, as most people know, although people I guess that don't go to shows wouldn't know, but a barrel pattern is a cloverleaf pattern involving 3 barrels, and they're measured. So you go around a barrel off to the right, and you got to come around it, and then you got to go around the left one, up to the top of the arena, around that one, and back. And the timing light is near the beginning, not close to the gate, but a little bit out from the gate. And I have kind of a dopey hat. It looks dopey to me, but it was for the fact that it was getting run over all the time. It wasn't my good hat, but this day, that's what I wore for the picture. We had to wear a hat over the timing light. If it flew off before the timing light, you're disqualified. Also, when you're going around the barrels, if you knock it with your knee and you knock it over, you get 5 seconds added to your time. So my horse was pretty trained, and he would get very close to the second barrel, and he would usually knock it over. And I started to learn how to pick it up at the same time. So I would pick it up and straighten it out on my way by and not get the 5 seconds shaved. Anyway, so probably my best barrel time is in the 15-second run. And my best pole bending time was very good. It was in the 18s.
Oh.
And I set the record at the Laird Fairgrounds, where I used to show the most often. And they announced it actually when I was visiting in the 90s, early 90s. Someone probably blew it apart by now, but I mean, it was pretty neat that I was able to do that.
In a context within the United States, rodeo served to cement the myth of the frontier, allowing for a heroic-seeming white population to conquer the frontier and prevail against the environment and the indigenous peoples who were there first. Rodeo supported the ideals of white male dominance, and when it caught on Canadian soil, this came with it. The myth of the frontier translated to the Canadian prairies and westward, where ranching was celebrated as the traditional way. When settling agricultural areas, particularly westward, the top-down push for farming as a great race was very prominent. David Jones calls this the zeitgeist of the Western settlement, and he uses a quote from Roosevelt to best explain this phenomenon. It states that It is the permanent greatness of any state that must ultimately depend more upon the character of its country population than anything else. No growth of cities, no growth of wealth can make up for a loss in either the number or the character of the farming population. Aside from racing and taming, rodeos often included parades, historical reenactments of this frontier myth, and entertaining opening ceremonies which reinforce the characterization and historical value of the Wild West, or in the Canadian context, a time when agriculture, farming, and settling of land was the most prominent. It is much easier when completing a historical analysis to gather up all the evidence and look at the larger picture. Rodeos, clearly, were meant for white males to show off their agricultural skill, which reinforces the dominant exclusionary context. In my mom's case, the picture was much smaller. For those participating, they were not considering or analyzing these events in this way. While they may fit into the larger picture of land settlement and white dominance, for them, especially within the area that my mom is speaking on, this was their way of life. They were taught to utilize community, have strength in each other, and share the weight of farming through the way that they were raised, as well as programs such as the 4-H Club. This also translated to horse shows.
So, can you tell us a little bit about what the environment was like when you went gaming? What did you do from start to finish, all day?
Well, first of all, you probably get ready like within a half a week or a week before it starts, because you have to pay early sometimes for fees, and you don't want to lose out on classes, because in the 80s, I don't know how it is now, I went a few years ago and there wasn't that many horses. But when I was involved, like we would have 55 horses in an open class. And they'd have to have 2 or 3 heats, so they'd have to announce, group 3, because there was just so many people and it's hot, right? It actually got so hot, they decided to change the games to the evening. So they brought in lights and we would start gaming at 6 p.m. because it was easier for the horses. I mean, it's a long day to stand there. But a show was very involved and I have to give a kudos again to my mom, because she would come along. Usually my dad was working or something. She would come along and feed everybody. She'd bring the old trailer and set up the Coleman stove and whip up like this big bowl of pancake mix and just start chiming out the flapjacks, and everybody would line up and she'd feed people. We had friends that would come over and
while the first half of my story simply describes the races, in the second half, one can take a closer look to determine the functions of community and the impact of gender in a rural environment, which develops the story setting that my mom just shared with us. Farm life and labor traditionally was divided by gender. According to a study on gender and farming in Ontario by Gloria Leckie, records of the work activities of North American farm families throughout the last 150 years show that farm women's work has typically consisted of several domains, including 1. A wide variety of household chores, 2. Childcare, 3. Gardening and food processing for domestic consumption, 4. Farm work in close proximity to the house, and 5. Seasonal field work. Farm girls tended to learn from both parents, growing up completing outdoor agricultural chores and indoor tasks. For these girls, Leckie describes a deep attachment to outdoor labor and housework as one of the necessary evils of girlhood. My grandmother, Christina, was one such woman. She grew up doing chores of the household, but her love was with the outdoors, working with her father on the farm and riding her horses.
And my mom grew up on that farm, and she loved horses, and she had this great big Palomino that was double registered, and she would ride him in parades. That was her thing. Apparently her horse would rear up and show off and walk on his hind legs down Queen Street. That was pretty neat. And she used to load him into the back of a big farm truck they had. That's how she took him.
Farming fathers would often teach their daughters how to run the farm the way they wanted it done, and mothers often train their daughters to be able to run a proper household in their absence or for when they left the home. A patient, supportive teacher was all the difference to these farm kids, highlighted by the women's experience in monthly study. This, of course, depended on the character of the adults in the children's lives, but a healthier teaching relationship is often more common, and that includes my family. My grandmother was haying fields by herself at the age of 6. Hay, however, is an example of the ways in which a supportive teacher does not mean just one person, but that it takes a village. The support that farm communities had stemmed from a long history of togetherness. Neighbors held working bees and participated in each other's chores for a century before my mom shared her bee experiences.
You know, but it was kind of a rule in our house that if you're haying, probably your neighbors would show up. So somebody had to make extra lemonade, extra muffins, whatever. So usually that was my mom. But like the neighbors would come running if they saw us out haying, you know, and they would help us. And then I got picked up by my blacksmith. Come on, I got someone who needs help. And I'm like, really? I just finished. You know, I had done 3 days straight or whatever. And he says, yep, we got to go. I said, okay, jump in the truck. Let's go. So we would help them hang, you know. And it's even now, it's just a sense of pride that I was involved in back in the day when people, you know, were really interested in helping each other. Like I remember attending a quilt bee. I mean, that's before the 80s. Like I was only 7 or 8. Nobody does that anymore. A quilting bee with my mom, you know. Like that's nice that it was that way, I think.
Within these experiences, one can see how much community was valued in rural life. Although the gender divide still pervaded the delegation of tasks, working together and a commitment to togetherness and hard work took precedent. This is the way that my mom describes the rodeo. Valuing this commitment prevailed over what we often think of rodeos as being. She remembers sharing downtime, my grandmother providing meals, friends caring for each other's horses and property, and tales of laughter despite the competition. Even with her recalling of horse shows, they would rotate in sharing meals and setup as well as operations and takedown, such as my grandmother dishing out breakfast.
There you go.
So it says, I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, my health to better living for my club, my community, and my country. And our motto was learn to do by doing.
That's why you always tell me that.
Well, I learned that.
My mom would give her shirt off her back for others, as would my grandmother, and this was cemented into every aspect, every event, and every experience this rural community shared. This is not to say that issues of sexism, racism, classism, and prejudice, as I had described earlier pertaining to the history of rodeo, did not exist here. The long history of settler agriculture and white dominance were definitely prominent, but in the memories of the culture and the community, being raised to be helpful and hardworking, as well as working together, are at the forefront. This differs from the individualistic, heroic nature of Wild West rodeos and Western media, as well as your usual 1980s individualism. Now that we've discussed the community values and the history of the shows my mom were involved in, what about her chaps? And the broader scene of the 80s. Chaps, in the grand scheme of things, are just a piece of protective equipment as stoneback studies. Various riding events require different levels of equipment such as padded gloves, various stirrups, chaps, and while helmets are not typically worn for style, they're always helpful, especially while training and in rougher events. Barrel racing, which is my mom's competition, does not require any major protective equipment, save for chaps and boots, the usual. Here's my mom explaining the functions of her chaps.
So these were important to me because, I mean, I started really young with the gaming, and I was used to, bare minimum, just my saddle, just my horse. It was a little slippery. And so the chaps actually helped hold me on my horse easier, which provided me with more hands-free guidance when it come to shaving off seconds. And I think it really helped because I did very well.
Chaps, for some, are simply just protective gear, but in the larger picture, they're a staple of Western fashion imagery. The whirlwind of Western fashion, and cowgirls in particular, has become a specific aesthetic with an expectation of sexuality and rural values, or conservative values. Oftentimes, it invokes the environment we just discussed. Neighborly and hardworking, but also white dominant, male dominant, and relatively conservative. The image of the cowgirl is particularly caught between building conservative views of how a proper woman should be and somehow also a sexual symbol. As Patton and Shedlock put it, the roles of cowgirls changed in the past 30 years from a woman of independence to a figurehead and sponsor girl used to promote the rodeo cowboy and culture. The climb they are referring to is the changing of the cowgirl through media from the early to mid-20th century. Cowgirls raised on ranches, such as those in my mom's community, and athletes in the ring were no longer the dominant imagery. On the silver screen in the 1940s and 50s, cowgirls were used as arm candy to the heroic cowboy figure, a figure who was there to conquer the frontier, or, in other terms, used his brute masculinity to exterminate any threats, from rogue indigenous peoples to either save or go home to his arm candy cowgirl. The cowgirl transitioned from arm candy to eye candy when she became an icon of pinup styles, posing wearing clothing impractical for farming and with oftentimes fake guns in advertisements and other media. Think of darling Dale Evans married to Roy Rogers, another white, heroic, conservative, manly man. The athlete in the ring was replaced with the imagery of bottle blonde darlings, and as Patton and Shedlock referred to them, the sex kitten cowgirls continued through the 1960s and 70s. Women who did not fit into the sex kitten stereotype were often seen as more androgynous, which is the lens that seems to fit the experience of my mom's community. While boys will be boys and teenage gender ideology still applies, there was a level of respect given to these women for their skill in competition and agricultural work. My mom had told me a story about how she gained respect for being able to bench press the most in her grade at the time. And when we take a look at fashion, we can see that there is an androgynous treatment of experiences such as this. Because they didn't fit into the sex kitten scheme, thank God they're teenagers, they were treated as more butch. Still women, but the focus was not on their gender, but rather their skill and their character over their physical appearance. Looking at this image of my mom's friends, probably around the age of 15 here, one can see the angle displayed in the clothing that the girls are wearing. Instead of imitating the sex kitten cowboy, again, thank goodness, they're wearing working clothes that are practical and geared towards helping them win events rather than show off while still looking nice. It's more similar to the male clothing designed for functionality than female silhouettes shown in these Western clothing ads. Speaking of Western clothing, it held a specific space in popular culture. Its design was to cement the cowboy as a folklore-adjacent character while somehow in keeping trends of the era, both inside and outside Western spaces, such as country music. Stars such as Johnny and June, Carter Cash, Willie Nelson, and Dolly Parton exemplified the country look. That country artists did not always dress Western, as one can see with Alabama or the Judds, who wore more popular 80s styles. A demand for showier Western wear rose with the popularity of the rodeo, particularly suits designed to emulate masculinity but also flashiness at the same time. This can be seen in the rhinestone cowboy suit of the 1960s and 70s, popularized by designer Nudie Cohn, which was one of the first Western fashion styles to break away from a strictly Western context to enter popular media. Female Western aesthetics included slim silhouettes, often still referencing the pinup cowgirl. The Western image was specifically to invoke the masculine cowboy or Southern darling character. Western was not just a style, but was meant to invoke decades of cultural context. Western wear as streetwear caught hold in the 1970s. Casual, denim, fringe, and large belt buckles that evoked Americana were beginning to break the scene. This continues into the 1980s, with hints of it here and there and everywhere, although not as a particularly dominant aesthetic or streetwear fashion. Abercrombie writes that this was cemented in the beginning of the 1980s, with media often set in Texas, such as Dallas or the John Travolta movie Urban Cowboy. The Western fashion and subsequent trends that my mom experienced were not involved in this collection of the West in the media, but rather from the agricultural scene that the streetwear attempted to emulate. Even their competition and parade clothing was practical.
My mom just loved that I was using blue. Like I had this blue blanket, and then so I found the blue breastplate, and I tried to wear blue to match, my horse as well. And the brown, just because he was classified as a bay horse, especially in this picture, he looks like he's a little bit brown, and everybody always thought he was pure black. So depending on how you viewed him, he could be brown or black, depending on the time of year as well. So I think it looked really nice.
The brown suede with his
color.
Yeah.
Yes.
And was it the latest style, or?
For then it was, yeah. Definitely was.
Flashy at your Toronto show.
Well, suede was starting to be bigger because leather was, around for a long time, right? And no one really thought to use suede as like a catchy looking something or other. And I was pretty proud too, because I had sort of blue suede boots for a while until I grew out of them, and that looked really nice too.
Yeah, with your blue coat, your blue blanket and everything.
That's right, yeah. I also had another shirt that was really neat, but because it was cream and it had like blue and pink flowers, and then I'd wear a blue tie, and that was the other shirt I like to wear that brought out the blue.
Oh, ever fancy.
She also describes my grandmother's parade outfit, a red button-down shirt with black fringe that matched her special saddle with silver accents, and then also discusses trends in her high school. While they leaned into common 1980s trends like polo shirts and Adidas bags, two items that her and my dad both had in common, they also developed their own that spoke to their rural experience.
Well, my experience was that, luckily, because our school was rural, some of the city folks called us the farmer school. But we had our little things at school, so I don't feel like I missed out on the city things too much, we did friendship pins on our running shoes, we had the name brand jeans, and everybody wore the jeans, and it was a really fun time. But the city kids wouldn't have little things we did, like, we would tie a little piece of leather strip around, like a suede leather strip around our necks. I worked for a riding stable, and that's what we did. It was kind of a thing that we had, and it caught on. Like a lot of people in my rural area anyway, that's what they were doing. They had to have the leather tied on there because that was cool.
You started a trend.
Started a trend. Yeah. It might not have been me specifically. Everyone was doing it at the riding stable I worked at, and I thought it was cool.
The clothing they were choosing to wear, while leaning into styles and gender roles of the time, needed to be functional for both their teenage lifestyles and the agricultural labor. Denim was both fashionable and functional. There seemed to be more value in practicality than in trends, despite choosing various cuts for the purpose of the trend, which differs from the 1980s pattern of endless cycles of trends on different cuts, fabrics, colors, while Western trends definitely had their own flair. Nobody was wearing giant triangle earrings in the field.
Would you say that your fashion and your trends were different than the city fashion and trends?
They were, but I like them. I like the Western vibe.
The Western vibe my mom is referring to is exactly the theme that I've been trying to stress, although in two separate worlds. The Western vibe is this dusty, romantic space of heroism, danger, and strong characters, with underlying themes of whiteness and male dominance, valuing masculine strength and female companionship. This is the Western vibe that Western streetwear serves to exude, and the Western aesthetic in mainstream pop culture in the 1980s. It's that confidence in a male lead who has a gorgeous love interest he'll ride off into the sunset with. The Western vibe that my mom and her community actually lived, however, is much different. The Western vibe in my mom's community was not just male leads and rides into the sunset, but everyday efforts of everyone to keep each other thriving. There is an enmeshment of both of these things in different activities, clothing pieces, songs, and media. However, neither are fully accurate at the same time, and neither are truly acknowledged within the 1980s, a decade full of individualism, consumerism, bright lights, bold lines, and blinding colors. By examining my mom's experience, one can learn that growing up rural has a long history of gender roles, but also gender cooperation, and that lived experience of Canadian farming does not translate into the Western one might picture having, valiant cowboys and suggestive women who also happen to just be wearing cowgirl boots. This Western image also doesn't translate to local rodeos that my mom participated in, but that does not mean that it becomes irrelevant. I'm looking at you, Calgary Stampede. Neither of these images fully fit within the 1980s zeitgeist, but hints of it fall into place at separate times. Whether you think the Western scene is good, bad, or ugly, it's important to consider the placement of rural memory within patterns of 1980s consciousness.
Yeehaw.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add or talk about that you didn't get to?
No, I don't think so. I think that's everything. I'm wondering if you'd like to be handed down my chaps, just in case you take up the sport.
Well, I'm allergic deeply, but I would really like to.